Hello, and thank you for joining us for this week's update. I'm Stephanie Hare, Senior Analyst for Western Europe here at Oxford Analytica, and I'm in conversation today with my colleague Joe Ford, our Senior Africa Analyst, and we're going to be talking about something rather counterintuitive, which is the opportunities of austerity. Now, Joe, in my region of Western Europe, every day the news is just getting grimmer. Further austerity, spending cuts, tax increases, and reform, and the same is happening across the pond in the Atlantic, in the United States and Canada. Now, this is causing problems, but you're here to tell us that it raises some interesting opportunities.
That's right, Steph. And we saw around the time of the Rio conference that one of the themes emerging from that people could discern was the sense of that in the formal government side of the conference, there was a great deal of distraction from the themes of sustainable development and so on, given the preoccupation with growth at least in the developed world. But one of the themes coming out of it was the relative dynamism associated with the corporate forum that took place around Rio in terms of these shifting roles, I suppose, in traditional divisions of roles between the public sector and the private sector in dealing with social development issues, in dealing with capacity building issues in developing countries and so on. So when we talk about the opportunities of austerity, one of the themes perhaps of that we might see emerging is that as austerity affects foreign services and aid agencies and so on in the developed world, the private sector might find itself fulfilling some of those roles in terms of supporting its host government, in terms of reform programs, some social development programs, those sorts of things, creating opportunities really to, in that way, also enrich their social license to operate and their sort of their purchase within those societies.
Now, this sounds very exciting for the private sector firms involved, and I'm sure would come as quite a relief for the beleaguered governments who are having to cut back on some of the services that they would provide or even the leadership roles that they might take. But I'm also wondering if there could be some risks attached to such a step as well. Can you talk us through some of those?
Well, yeah, there's certainly a risk. It may be only one that emerges later on, but one could say, I suppose, there's a sort of slippery slope risk here, which is that the more burden firms take on in terms of delivery of social and public goods and so on, either in their limited locality in the case of a mine or what have you, or generally within a country in terms of contributions to national water supplies or what have you, is that over time the expectations on the part of government, on the part of communities of what firms are able to provide start to rise, and the sort of attribution to those firms of an expected public offering, which beyond paying tax, beyond simply employing people, which firms are not necessarily well placed to manage, and they're particularly not well placed to manage it in some less well understood countries where their foreign services has faced austerity, and therefore the diplomatic advice and diplomatic facilitation that would normally be available to them is not in place.
Now, this raises a second risk, which I'm thinking of for both the private sector firms, but also potentially the governments that they might be partnering with, which is that if they get it wrong, this could have blowback, either at the governments back home and the foreign policy initiatives that they're trying to do in terms of around the world, or even how those firms operate around the world, because we're often talking about multinational firms here in this case. So there's a different risk dimension that perhaps hasn't been completely thought of. Sure,
there's a risk dimension in terms of, and it depends by sector and by nature of company and whether it has, for example, a reputation and a profile back home in the country of its incorporation. But one of the things it points to, and one of the things our business and society practice is helping clients with, is it's developing that sort of overview of a joined up world in terms of operating across jurisdictions and what is driving these new expectations around transparency and revenue transparency and anti-corruption and so on, and how firms can navigate these emerging trends.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joe. And thanks to you. If you'd like to read more about these issues, please check out the Daily Brief, where we cover them on a regular basis, and our website, where you can go to our Business and Society page. And we'll see you next week.